afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Birdie. On behalf of Blackstone National Brewing Company, I want to thank everyone for being here today. We've got an exciting little historical beer program. If you came for that, we appreciate you coming. If you just happen to come get a beer, you're getting some free entertainment while you're drinking. So, hope you enjoy. We're going to start off with Dr. Janusek from Vanderbilt. Is going to kind of talk about the program today, and we got several different speakers, including Beth, Conklin, and myself. But we're pretty much going to cover thousands and thousands of years of brewing history, and then afterwards we'll give a little tour here of the brewery as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to John.
Hey, thank you, Scott. It's nice to be able to do this here. I wanted to just sort of start this by saying that one of the things that started this. From my perspective is that my colleague Bruce Carter, who I think will be here shortly, and I started a course at Vanderbilt called The History and Science of Brewing. And we noticed that there was a lot of interest at Vanderbilt, not just among students, of course, right, but also among faculty to not just simply continue this course, but to actually create something a little bit bigger, some kind of program or something. And so this is something we've been working on. We'd like to organize a bigger conference next year, but this is like a great start. And it's I want to say also that it was great to be back in touch with my old friend Scott Birdie, who I've known for many years. We met because we were both collectors of Breweriana, and particularly, from my standpoint, vintage beer cans. I have some here. And we've kind of gotten back together as a team working now on the history of brewing and in relation to Scott's expertise, which is the history of brewing in the U.S. and Nashville. And what I'm really interested in is the deep history, what I like to call the deep history of brewing, culture, the importance of beer for humans. And so a take-home point for what I'll be talking about a bit is that beer is essentially, and fermented beverages in general, central to human civilization. So what I want to say is I'll talk a little bit about the deep history of brewing, I'll talk about some ancient cultures, and then I'll move into South America, the South American Andes, where I work. Then I'll introduce my colleague Beth Conklin. We're both in the Department of Anthropology at Vanderbilt. She's an expert in the Amazonian region of South America, and she has some great research she's done on the role of beer there. Then we'll turn it over to Scott, who'll talk about the history of brewing in Nashville, and then, as Scott said, we'll have a brewery tour. So as I said, beer is central to human civilization. Just to quickly introduce beer as a kind of beverage, an alcoholic beverage, a psychoactive beverage, right? Is generally characterized as a beverage focused on the fermentation of grain. Usually barley, as we know it, but sometimes other things as well. And in the ancient past, basically, people were taking just about anything that you could ferment and fermenting it at some point. So we'll talk about South America where corn was central, but in Africa, sorghum and millet, in Asia, rice, of course. Sake is basically kind of a form of beer, right? Because it is a fermented grain centered on rice. But in the course I teach also, there are of course other psychoactive drinks, mead in Northern Europe, wine in Europe. The Mediterranean Romans and Greeks were really focused on grapes, and they considered beer drinkers uncivilized, right? Pulque, which is an agave drink in Mexico, and of course distilled spirits, which is a different thing. Now, beer is central to human civilization, but also, let's say one of the other key points I want to make is that beer is always political. It's always a political thing, right? So, for example, Beth will talk about in Amazon the distinction between strong, angry, and weak beer, right? Sweet beer, right? In the Andes, many different varieties of chicha. Families guarded their recipes. Same thing with pulque in Mexico and other drinks as well. And even in the history of the U.S., ales versus lagers. When Germans immigrated in the mid-1800s, lagers took over, and the distinction between ales and lagers is a huge part of U.S. history. And of course today, which I have at the bottom here, corn syrup versus rice, right? You guys have all seen this, right? We don't use corn syrup. Well, you use rice. So, and by the time, I don't know what you think, Fred, but like using corn syrup, it gets eaten up by the yeast anyway, right? Yeah, so, wait, what's the point? So,
there's no corn syrup or rice in this brewery. I just want to specify.
Good point. Thank you, Scott.
Not now, right?
Not now. Until we get spot now. So beer is always political. You guys might remember this beer summit in 2009. Yes. It was kind of a racial issue, but this was a kind of a central symbolic act, right, over beer. This is one act, but it's one of many. We'll keep this away from the computer. I've done this far too many times. Yes, I have killed computers with beer. But basically is a kind of key point for thinking about the role of brewing and beer in politics and human history. So now, let's go back. In 1953, the archaeologist Robert Braidwood posed this question. He was a Mesopotamian archaeologist, and they were finding a lot of evidence for early domestication of grains like barley and wheat, and posed this question, but basically, is it bread that came first, or is it beer, right? And this is still kind of a chicken and the egg kind of question. We can go back to this in discussion, and I know Fred has some ideas about this. But what is it that came first? And probably they came hand in hand. Basically, the idea that if people are domesticating, they're cultivating, right? They're growing grains, they're harvesting wild grains, ultimately domesticating them. That is, changing their genetic structure and changing the relationship of humans and grains and other kinds of plants. What was it they were making, beer or bread? My short answer will be probably both right about the same time. But, Weekly World News. I'll let Fred jump in later. Let's go to the Fertile Crescent for a minute, because this is where some really interesting recent research has been done. Actually, older and recent research. I'll take you through some of the newer, and then we'll go back to some of the older research. The Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia in the eastern portion, the Levant in the western portion of the Mediterranean. Work in the Levant most recently focused on a culture known as Natufian. Now these were basically hunter-foragers, right? They were not hunters-foragers. They were basically, there's no evidence for domestication of grains at this point, right, for animals. In other words, that kind of transformation where people and plants become, kind of intertwined with one another, interrelated, symbiotic with one another, right? So they're foraging, they're cultivating grains. What Li Liu, I just met her a couple of weeks ago at our SAA, our archaeology conference in Albuquerque, found with a team of archaeologists at Stanford is that the fermentation of grains was probably going on 13,000 years ago in the Levant. That's before the origins of agriculture, that is before the origins of domesticated grains. It's before agriculture as we know it, right, as a thing. And so basically, while I'm not saying this tells us that beer came before bread, what it does say is that beer, the production of a fermented beverage, was central to the kinds of changes that led to farming. And farming, agriculture, transformed humanity. It's why we're here right now, right? For better or worse.
Yeah, many drunk farmers.
Yeah, many drunk farmers, right? And so just some examples. And one other aspect of this is that not only were they fermenting, but they were doing it in specific contexts. In cemeteries, in a cave. Rockafet Cave is the one that she found. There's about 30 burials there. And a lot of starch granules that showed definite evidence for being transformed in the ways that mashing and fermentation will do to these granules. And one of the strengths of her research is that she did experimental archaeology on how the various processes of brewing, from malting to mashing to fermentation, will transform these granules, and compared it to the granules they were finding there in that cemetery. And so these are just some scientific images. Let's kind of blow through these, but to give you the sense that this archaeology is pretty rigorous in relation to these graves. And also, a nearby site had associated with the fermented, transformed granules, an elderly woman buried with dozens of tortoise shells. A feast, right? A tortoise feast. Can you imagine that? We're going to feast on tortoises today. But basically, what it's pointing to is the role of beer in religion, burials, the dead, right? But also in a feasting kind of context, which points to the role of politics in this kind of situation, right? People coming together and doing things for their dead, in relation to their dead, but also in a way that's probably bringing people together in a kind of political formation, right? So basically, brewing, feasting, ritual drinking was going on before domestication. That's pretty cool, folks. At least I think so. And I think we've got some good evidence also in China. Now this, until about 3 years ago, was where we had the earliest evidence for brewing a kind of a grain-based beverage in the world. And this is basically, and brewing, by the way, has continued in China throughout the different dynastic periods. Just to show you China, just to give you a geographical sense of the area. Jiahu, you may have heard of it. Dogfish Head recreated a recipe based on an early drink that they found at this little community in basically what is eastern China. And that's what, actually, we're going to go back here. That's what you're looking at here is their bottled Jiahu. That tattoo, I love that tattoo on her back, actually is the logograph for a fermented drink in China.
You have that on your back too, your lower back.
I don't actually have a tramp stamp myself, but I'm thinking about getting one, so we'll see.
I was there for 12 years.
Let's get matching ones, John.
I was 12 years in Janusek.
Oh, great, yeah.
So we did that.
Oh, cool. Yeah, so again, what we're finding, though, is that this is going on in relationship to burials, to mortuary, these kind of mortuary rituals, religion, right? Just kind of blowing through. And also, a cool thing is they found these bone flutes in relation to these burials, where you had vessels buried with them with clear evidence for this kind of brew, this jiahu on them. And what was this brew? And I should point out my colleague Patrick McGovern, you must know him, at Penn State, who's been doing a lot of research, doing residue analysis on these pottery vessels. And actually, you can determine, at least in a general sense, what kinds of elements are kind of left behind. And what did they find? They found basically that an early, maybe the best term for this is grog, but basically a fermented honey beer, but actually involved a fermented rice, probably. With a kind of fermented, the evidence for tartaric acid is a clear sign that there's some kind of fruit involved with this as well. And probably, given the importance of hawthorn fruit in China, we think it's hawthorn. So when Sam Calagione of Dogfish Head recreated this, he used hawthorn, right? Yeah. It could be grapes. We can't, sometimes the resolution's a little difficult to get at. But basically a combination of fermented rice, fermented fruit, and honey. And honey's easy to find because when you have vessels like the ones I showed here, that stuff really preserved. The beeswax stays, and so you can get those residues really easily.
With this type of fermented beverages, you had a lot of people getting wine.
Oh,
yeah. Wine is the higher molecular alcohols, methyl alcohols.
That would have been, and so right, this would have been a high alcoholic beverage. When you put together fermented grains, fermented fruit, and fermented honey, that's probably, how high could you get with that, you think, Fred?
You can get up to 22.
22%, yeah. So we're getting into almost distilled beverage territory here. And so as I said, Sam Calagione, one of the guys who's been recreating a lot of these ancient brews, has recreated this one. Had to make some decisions, because we don't know exactly what fruit. I think they used hawthorn in the end. What kind of yeast, of course, you have to figure out what kind of yeast you use. But basically did a nice, I didn't try it, you may have tried it, but in any case, it was a great experiment, a great example of how we can bring some of these drinks back to life, so to speak. Now let's move over quickly to the eastern side of the Fertile Crescent, over into Mesopotamia. And we tend to think about Mesopotamia as kind of the origins of everything, and sort of, yes, but it's a very hostile environment. It's very dry. But it's one of the earliest after this evidence from Israel and China for early brewing. And some of the images you'll see from Mesopotamia show people gathered around as a family or as a community drinking beer out of straws, right? I'll get back to this in a moment. But this is kind of an iconic image of drinking beer in Sumeria or Mesopotamia. And it's like one of these things where it shows us that, again, beer is about, bringing people together. It's about sociality. It's about people coming together, drinking. And this is probably where a lot of discussions are happening, right, around the beer vessel. So one of the earliest bits of evidence from Mesopotamia is this stamp seal from the site of Tepe Gawra, where you have a big vessel, undoubtedly a fermentation vessel, and people drinking out of straw. Now, you may have heard of the deity Ninkasi. Ninkasi was in Mesopotamia the deity associated with brewing and beer. We know of, and Scott's going to show a tablet. He's going to show the tablet where we have evidence for a hymn to Ninkasi. It was probably actually a hymn sung when a woman opened a beer tavern in Babylonia. But what it shows, I don't know if you can see this, if you read through the hymn, you get the sense of you are the one who handles the dough with a big shovel, mixing it in a pit. The bapper. Bapper is a barley bread that people probably used to help create the beer in the vessel. You are the one who bakes the vapor in the oven. You are the one who waters the malt. You are the one who soaks the malt in the jar. You are the one who spreads the cooked mash on large reed mats. It's a recipe. It's basically a very broad recipe for brewing. But also, if you go through and look at the relationship, it's like the onrush of the Tigris and Euphrates. It's a reflection on the environment of Mesopotamia. Very dry landscape dependent on the Tigris and Euphrates. And that's right here. It's an ecological sort of treatise on this region, right? So it's all about the landscape of Mesopotamia and also kind of a broad recipe for how to make a barley-based drink. And I just love this about Mesopotamian Sumerians. They're so anal retentive about their bureaucracies, just like us, right? Just like Americans. And so you'll find thousands of tablets like this, many of which record rations during festivals in which beer were involved, right? So tablets, cuneiform tablets, using a stylus to make these kind of indentations in these clay tablets. And here's one, for example, where it basically gets across, it communicates how many of so many different types of vessels were going to be provided at a particular festival, right? And how many in relation to high-ranking officials, how many for the commoners. So 5 big vessels of a certain kind of beer, 35 small vessels of another kind of beer, anal retentive, right? But what we clearly see here is that beer was central to the festivals. And by the way, these are all found in temples in Mesopotamian cities. And so these are basically, again, political statements. Like, you're bringing people together. People are basically helping build the temples, maintain the temples, build irrigation canals, and they're recording how much beer and how many different vessels of different types of beer are going to be provided for this, right? Back to those straws. Today, it's still a common tradition in Africa for people to come together as a community and drink out of straws. And one of the things about those straws is that the beer that'll last about 15 seconds. It's always funny seeing people's faces when that happens. One of the communities in Africa that an anthropologist recorded, one of their greetings is, when you meet someone on the street, literally you say, "How's your beer?" Because that is the invitation to come over and have a beer with you, right? And so people gather, as you can see, as a community. This is the way of forming community, is by coming together and drinking together out of straws of a beer. And one of the reasons for this is also these beers are very, what's the word for this? Alcoholic. They're very alcoholic, but there's also a lot of stuff in them, right? It's kind of they're chewy. And so basically the straws are filtering, and all the straws have filters on them. And so they're filtering out a lot of that stuff. And I should back up and say that one of the things about beer in ancient history is also that it's a food, right? We got to think of it as a food, as a nutritious food. And a lot of it was very, we're used to our relatively unfiltered beer, or filtered beers here, but actually a lot of it generally was unfiltered. Even in early U.S. colonial history in our own country. And just quickly, Egypt.
Question here, John.
Yes.
Did you have to bring your own straw to these events, or did they provide them?
Overall, I think they provide them, and there's also all kinds of rules about straw. Like, you can't sneeze while you're doing this. If you sneeze, you have to turn away. I mean, it's a very rule-regulated thing, and you have to do it in certain ways. You can't walk in front of someone. There's a lot of rules. So, as people come together, it's this really regulated but communal sort of event. It's really cool. I don't know what plant they are, but they are basically a kind of the stem of some plant.
Okay.
Now, in the straw, yeah, and in the past we have, so elites in Mesopotamia had metal ones sometimes, copper, right? So it varied depending on status.
In '85, I published an article, Beer is Food.
Yeah.
And I had all that stuff in there and a lot of research, and I just immigrated. And so I got a call, if I want to have my papers, stay away from publishing or things like that.
And that's a good point. The beer is a food. We got to think of it that way, right? Always has been.
But
That's
I couldn't say that in 85.
No, you couldn't say it in 85. And also, it's like, we tend to think of beer in certain ways. And one of the things when we get across is beer is central. It's not simply a leisurely, even for us it's not. We think of it that way. It's actually central to the kinds of social activities that we conduct. And I'll say one thing just very quickly about Egypt before I say a few things about South America. Egyptians were I'm sorry, but that their emphasis on death to me is just crazy. And so pyramids, of course, as monumental tombs, elites would be buried with all kinds of figures, models like these. In some cases showing bakeries and breweries. These guys were alive for them. These were little workers that when someone died, they would continue to brew and bake for them in the afterlife, right? And we find hundreds of these things from different Egyptian tombs. They're quite amazing. But again, their emphasis, there's basically an open-up model of one of those models where you see people working away and breaking and brewing, which often go hand in hand, of course. You're working with yeast, you're fermenting. But it's just, their emphasis on death to me is just kind of bizarre. So just a quick few things about South America. I work in the South American Andes, but this will be a lead into what Beth will talk about in the Amazonian region. So the Andes is basically that spine along the western portion of the South American continent. And beer, drinking, and brewing is central to human life here. Now, again, like in many other places, people were brewing or they were fermenting what they could get their hands on. But the most valued thing in the Andes was corn. You all know quinoa. They did ferment quinoa, and that's one thing we're talking about, perhaps doing a quinoa chicha here at the brewery down the road. But corn was central, and so there's different kinds of chicha. This corn beer, this chicha de jora, chicha morada. Morada is basically this kind of darker purplish corn. And they all grade. They vary on the gradient of alcohol content depending on how long they ferment them. And of course, corn doesn't have the same power, the enzymes that barley does to ferment, right? It's diastasic power, right? But corn can be fermented, especially because if you chew it, if you masticate it, we have in our saliva those enzymes to transform that starch, that transform those enzymes and ferment the corn. And so basically chewing, largely the role of women in the Andes was how chicha was fermented throughout most of human history. You can germinate corn too, but it takes long. It takes a little bit more, quite a bit more work actually, by masticating it. By people sitting around. Here's some images right here of women sitting around, historical images of people chewing, masticating corn to make a chicha was central. But also corn and drinking chicha was central to, again, religion and politics in the Andes. And it still is today. We tend to think of drinking to forget, right? We drink to forget. In the Andes, you drink to remember. You drink to remember your ancestors. That state of consciousness you enter is the state at which you can communicate with those who preceded you. And those who preceded you, the most distant ones, are embodied in mountains, the very high glaciated or snow-capped peaks of the Andes. And so chicha taverns are actually fairly common, at least until recently. Now most people drink beer. Chicha is not quite as common as it was. But traditionally it was the main drink, again, the most highly valued, being the corn drink. And it's also about power. You want to build a political faction, you want to get people together to help build an irrigation canal or help build a temple, throw a feast and bring lots and lots of chicha. That will get people working for you, right? In a nutshell. But also, I think a lot of people find this fascinating, that a common ritual in the Andes, until recently, is every community, or many communities, would have a kind of ritual battle, where they would work out tensions in the community. It was all very highly regulated, but all also at the end of this battle, once people came together and feasted and drank beer together, the community was reformed. And so, you've all heard of the Inca Empire, going back in time now. The Inca Empire was built over the course of less than 100 years, and much of the political machinery that went into building this empire was about the production of feasts and the brewing of beer to basically win constituents over for Inca emperors. And so you have manuscripts, illustrated manuscripts like this, where we see people drinking together, often in relation to their tombs. These are typical Inca vessels for serving and fermenting beverages here. And one thing I will say about the role of women in brewing. Throughout most of human history, women were generally the brewers. That goes as much for the Inca, for the Mesopotamians, as for early U.S. history as well. Generally, women are the ones doing the brewing. It's like, again, it's a food. It's like a domestic task. Women are the brewers until it becomes lucrative. Then the men take over. Or the Inca takes over and creates an institution called Akla, where women were the brewers and the textile weavers for the Inca. And these were the people, this institution of women who were brewing the beer that fueled these feasts, in which the Inca won over, created constituents. That was central to the building of this empire. And so this also meant constructing massive terraces to grow corn, and in some cases quinoa, right? So transforming the environment, transforming the ecology of the region by turning mountain slopes essentially into terraced hill slopes. I'll move along here. And here are some images just of people drinking beer with their dead. Again, remembering your ancestors. On certain occasions, going to the tombs and drinking with them and making offerings to them. Bringing out the mummies and drinking with them. Decorating. This is a deceased Inca mummy on the left here, where they would deck them out and they would drink with them. And those mummies would toast each other with their people. If you toasted one another, you showed an alliance between these deceased Inca rulers. And again, the ultimate sacrifice. Inca did do human sacrifice on a very small scale. It was a very powerful event where children were gathered. Local leaders would offer their children for this sacrifice, and by doing so, they gained a lot of status, a lot of local power. And the kids were brought up to the tops of mountains. They were given a lot of beer. They were feasted. They were feted. And then they were sacrificed and buried on the tops of mountains like this. And my colleague Johan Reinhardt has been one of the ones basically climbing these mountains and finding these child sacrifices. But beer, again, central to these rituals and the artifacts buried with them. Now I'm just going to end with the civilization I work on. It's called Tiwanaku, and it's basically the Inca consider themselves to originate from Tiwanaku, which is located in the Lake Titicaca Basin, just to the south of the Inca Empire. And I don't need to show much. There's a number of temples, and if you look closely, you'll see stone sculptures or monoliths placed within them. In these sculptures, my wife Anna Gingrich and I are actually working on a book about these sculptures. Here's some of the key the vessels used to serve chicha for the Tiwanaku. I have one of them covered in my book that came out a while ago. There's one of those temples. Each one of those sculptures, the main sculptures, holds in the left hand a kero, a drinking vessel, for serving beer. And in the right hand, a tablet for ingesting hallucinogenic substances. So there's 5 of these different guys. They're each holding this kind of goblet. Let me go back there for a minute. This is what they look like for presenting beer. In other words, providing this liquid for feasts that would have brought people together in these temples and created this society.
I've asked John to bring me back one of those vessels for my beer can collection. I thought that'd be a great addition. And he said he would end up in Libyan jail. Take that out. So.
I can make you one. We can make
It's a
It's not for research, you can bring it back.
These are some of my favorite cans. DeSoto. It took me a while to get that one. Anyway, so I thought I'd end there and just hopefully get across a bit that beer has been with us, fermented drink, grain-based drink with around us for a long time. And maybe turn it over to Scott, or you want to test that?
Ready for Beth? Yeah, I'll get her.
Thanks very much.
So before we do the tour, we're going to talk about a few little exciting things that John and I have been doing with some of his team at Vanderbilt just this past week. Some of you may have seen it in the news, but a couple of cool little archaeological things going on related to Nashville's brewing history and the National Brewing Company. But before that, we're going to get Beth up here. And Dr. Beth Conklin.
So thanks so much. It's really nice and fun to get to talk about this. So I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of someone who's worked for a very long time with a particular group of indigenous people in Western Brazil. The people I work with are known as the Wari. I guess I don't have a pointer, but if you look at the far western part where Brazil sort of bulges out above Bolivia and go down just a little bit south, they're right across from the Bolivian border there. So this is classic rainforest. It's an area where there are no roads. We traveled by boat, basically. These are pictures of the Wari from the first contact, which happened in the 1950s. So they are people who have been in a relationship with the outside world for about 60 years now. So what I want to talk about is Chicha. So John was just talking about this. Across South America, Chicha is the word for homebrews, basically. John speaks Spanish, and in Spanish it's pronounced as a CH. In Brazil it's Portuguese, so it's an SH. So I'll be saying Chicha, but it's the same thing that John was talking about. So Chicha is the term for a wide variety of homebrewed beverages that range from relatively non-alcoholic to quite alcoholic, that are mostly made at home. So, sorry, I didn't know that we'd have PowerPoints, so I didn't work these in, so I'm not quite sure what's coming up, but I was getting some images. These are Wari today. This was a really great moment that doesn't relate to Chicha, but I had been in Austria and had stumbled on a film that was made from the very first contact with the group that I worked with. In 1956, no one knew it existed. It was completely by chance to find it. There was no narration and no notes, and so we took still photographs back to try to track down who it was, and I thought they looked familiar, but I didn't really know. It turned out to be the guys who I've worked with most, the shamans, the elders in the community, when they were in their teens and 20s, and they were so beautiful. The fathers of these two men were in the photographs, and so it's incredibly moving to them to see their dads at this moment when the people had just come out of the forest. In lowland South America, and I'm going to just say Amazonia, although there are other parts of the lowlands, Native people make fermented beverages from a really wide range of different kinds of plants, primarily starchy crops, but also palm fruits. So the two main ones are manioc, which you may know as cassava or yucca root, and corn or maize. So for Wari, it's corn. They traditionally didn't even have manioc, cassava. And you can see here this woman, the carrying basket. There are no roads, there's no animals, there's no transportation, so everything's carried in carrying baskets on your head. So she's coming from the fields and has both palm fruits there and corn. Corn Chicha, which what you call toqua, is their main staple beverage, and they use it, as John said, in two forms. There's what they call sweet Chicha, which is only lightly fermented, and then there's strong or angry Chicha, which is very strongly fermented. So sweet Chicha is what people drink on an everyday basis. It's just always present in households. You offer it to anybody who comes by. It's only lightly fermented. You can start drinking it as soon as it's made, and as it sits around in your household, it may get a little more alcoholic, but not very much. It's what anthropologists often call near beer. So it has some alcohol, but not a lot. So the other kind of Chicha, the angry Chicha, the strong Chicha, is a strongly fermented version of exactly the same drink that's allowed to ferment for a number of days so that it becomes much more alcoholic. So what I want to talk to you about today is some of the sort of eye-opening things that I've learned from working with Wari about how they use, make, and think about beer in ways that are really different from the way that we do. So one of the major differences is that the strongly fermented alcoholic shisha is something that they don't drink on an everyday basis. And in fact, they use it only in very specific kinds of rituals and party situations. Only adults drink it, and in certain contexts, only men drink it. And weirdest of all, in the biggest festivals, the people who make the beer, who make mass quantities of beer, as I'll tell you later, don't drink any of it. They give all of it to their guests. So it's a very different social pattern around beer than we have. And then finally, and perhaps even more strangely, drinking alcoholic shisha, the strongly fermented shisha, isn't really a focus of pleasure or even intoxication. It's about inflicting pain and punishing and proving you're machismo. So this is what I wanted to talk about today, which is the range of uses and meanings that beer can have that go far beyond pleasure and intoxication. So first, major point, as John emphasized, and I just want to underline this, brewing is a women's art. Sorry guys, but for thousands of years in every culture around the world, it's been women who are the brewers, women who have the knowledge, women who have the skill, women who control the production. It makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Throughout history, brewing has been a part of food preparation. It's taken place around hearths, it's taken place in kitchens. It's been part of the staple flow of food that nourishes families. In cosmologies and mythologies worldwide, the deities associated with brewing are goddesses. They're female fertility figures. And as I'll talk about for the Wari, there's also a very strong association between brewed beverages and female reproduction, women's blood, childbirth, and so on. So it's odd, I think, to us because, until very recently, I think that brewing has been very male-dominated, and in many ways still is, in this society, right? But if we look at that historically, that's a really recent development. So, brewing traditionally, let's say in Europe, was a way that women could make money out of their own homes, and it was especially a way that women who were widowed, who didn't have the support of a man, it was one of the main things that they could do that was lucrative enough to support themselves and their families. So when guilds began to form and regulate apprenticeship and entrance into professions, guilds formed around beer making, and in most places they excluded women. So that was one of the key moments at which you started to sort of concentrate male control over brewing. Interestingly, just as a tidbit of factoids here, there was one town in the Netherlands that allowed women into the guilds for beer making. And between 1518 and 1663, there were 563 brewers in that city. Of the 563, 97 were women, and 3/4 of those women were widows.
The U.S. has now a female brewers society called the Pink Beer Society. The Pink Boots. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is really a return to roots. It's a return to where
Changing
we
the
came
white guys with beards image, right?
Yeah, so brewing shifted in our experience. I want to emphasize in most of the world it still is a female thing. But in our sort of Euro-focused tradition, brewing became male-dominated through a series of things that happened. One was back in the 12th century, monasteries in Europe identified brewing and the sale of beer as a way that they could generate income. And so the monasteries began to take it over. However, nuns continued to be brewers as well as monks. So the guilds then, 500 or so years later, began excluding women. And then with the industrialization of beer production, it became much more strongly male-dominated. And then women were sort of relegated to being the barmaid, to selling the beer or distributing it, rather than actually producing it. So among the Wari with whom I work, however, women grow the corn, women process the corn. The way that they prepare beer begins with harvesting, obviously, but then grinding corn. This is a really distinctive way of doing it. You're probably familiar with Mesoamerican metates that you push away from yourself on a stone. This is a rocker stone that goes from side to side instead. It's a distinctively Wari thing. Ground corn is then placed into a pot, and traditionally, this is before that first contact that I told you about in the 1950s, before then, as John mentioned, the traditional way to break the starchiness of corn down into simple sugars so that fermentation could take place was to masticate it, to chew it. And so if you meet elderly Wari women, oftentimes their molars are really, really ground down because they spent so many hours and hours of their earlier life chewing corn and then spitting it into a pot. The enzymes in the saliva then go to work on the ground corn. So when they finally in the 50s and 60s entered into relationships with the outside world, when sugar arrived, at first people thought it was really weird because nothing's that white, right? But the women quickly realized that they could just throw some sugar into the pot and not have to chew it anymore, and that saved so much female labor. We're very excited about that. So Wari make shisha only from corn. They don't add anything else, but interestingly, a number of other Amazonian groups add some kind of fungus or mold. And this can be fungus that's found growing on particular trees in the forest. It can be packets of vegetative matter that are placed in the rafter of houses until it develops a characteristic kind of mold. And so those will be added at a certain place. There's a kind of double fermentation that takes place. So human relationships with microbes are living relationships. We may not be able to see them, but they comprise more than half of all of the cells in our bodies. They're integral to every single function that we have physiologically. Our thoughts, our emotions, our moods, all of those are mediated by microbes. These are really animated, lively relations. And they're also very locally specific. So I have a colleague named Philippe Erickson who lives in Paris and works with indigenous groups just across the border into Bolivia. And he's one of the main scholars in Amazonia on Amazonian Chicha, beers and so on. And his wife, Hélène, has been with him in the field for many, many years. So back in Paris, they wanted to brew some traditional Amazonian Chicha. And Hélène is very meticulous, and so she went to all the Parisian markets. She found exactly the right kind of manioc, cassava. She did everything exactly as she had learned to do it with the women that they worked with in Bolivia, and it never worked. They tried over and over, it never worked. And then by chance, they happened to get out some moldy old hammocks. And I don't know if any of you have lived in the tropics, but when I come back from the field, like every piece of clothing, you know, every hammock, everything I have has this very, very distinctive smell because there's mildew, there's mold, there's all those tropical microorganisms. And Len discovered that only in the presence of these moldy hammocks would the shisha ferment as it was supposed to do. So they may be invisible, but the microbes very much are co-collaborators in this living relationship. So in recent years, microbiologists have begun to study microbial populations, the microbiomes in human bodies in various indigenous Amazonian groups, and they found a lot of fascinating things. One thing that they found is that the microbiome of people who live only a few miles apart in neighboring communities can be quite distinct and different. And the idea is basically that there's very, very local microbial communities. The soil, the water is distinctive. And so when people live together in a community, when they consume food and water from that community, and especially when they share drinking vessels, passing around bowls or cups of shisha, they come to share a collective sort of microbial signature. And this relates to the fact that Wari, like many other Amazonian Indians, are always saying, you know, those people stink, you know. And they claim to be able to identify people, where they're from, and even who the individual is, without seeing them or hearing them, simply by the scent. So scent is the signature, it's the way that microbial populations make themselves evident, so there may be something to this. The other thing that many indigenous Amazonian groups say is that local shishas have very distinctive different flavors. They're not all the same, even if they're all made from the same ingredients. So local specificity, and then coming back to the gender components, many people say that the best shisha, the tastiest shisha, comes from the prettiest girls. So,
True terroir.
Absolutely, yes. So everywhere in Amazonia, there's a lot of symbolism centered around shisha and shisha drinking. So for the Wari, as I said, the primary symbolic distinction is between the less fermented sweet shisha and the strongly fermented angry or strong shisha. So sweet shisha, which is the shisha that's produced within the household, that's sort of a staple food, is symbolically associated with women, with blood, with nourishment, with vitality, with fertility, with conviviality, with the safety of domestic life and belonging within the household. And everywhere, it's the quintessential gesture of hospitality, to offer sweet shisha to a guest, to whoever comes by. So it's associated with the domestic life of the family, and it also has a kind of transformative quality. Much in the same way that it's associated with women and women's blood, which is what creates kinship among people, offering sweet shisha to someone and having them accept and drink of it is a way to turn a stranger into a friend, and it's a way to turn a friend into family over time. If you accept shisha from someone, if you drink with them, eventually you become part of their intimate social world. So why do you offer shisha to guests as soon as they arrive? And to refuse to accept shisha from someone would be hugely insulting. It would be to negate the relationship, to reject that individual. So you always need to accept. So there's a symbolism of pairing shisha and meat, with meat being the quintessential masculine food produced by men who do almost all of the hunting, and shisha being the quintessential female food. So Wari didn't really have a total marriage ceremony before the first contact, but they kind of liked the idea, so they've been riffing on this for a while. And in the marriage ceremony, sort of, the main thing that happens is that the parents lecture the bride and groom on the need for her to produce shisha, for him to produce meat, for them to share food, and in sharing food, they're said to become one blood, one body. So it's at that moment when we would say, I now pronounce you husband and wife, instead the Wari will say, now you're one body, now you're one blood. It's really beautiful, and it's a transformation that's affected by sharing food, and especially by sharing shisha. So let me just go through some photos since I don't know what's coming up. So this is not the production of shisha, but it's interesting, and it's something that other people do to produce shisha. And this is manioc, which the Wari do now have. And this is the fermenting of manioc. It's very common in Amazonia to sink an old dugout canoe or an old boat and to just let the manioc ferment in the water for a number of days. In this case, with the fermentation, it helps to reduce the toxicity of the toxins that you have to squeeze out.
Sounds like we're wasting a lot of money on all this stainless for sanitation.
Oh,
That's why we use wood.
Yeah, so this association of women with shisha, men with meat, plays out in a lot of different contexts. One of the most fun is a ritual called kawaiiwa, which means begging. And I only learned about this because it just sort of burst out of nowhere. It generally begins when women are getting annoyed that the men are just like sitting around and they're not going out hunting and they're being lazy, and so the women will in secret organize a kind of solidarity movement where suddenly all of them collectively appear in the village sort of singing and kind of screeching in a very high-pitched voice, going from house to house, berating the men for not hunting and urging them to get it together and to go out. And so obviously the men have to take up this challenge.
Is my wife in there?
So the men do this. They go out. They don't dare to come back until they've got a lot of game. And when they do, while they're gone, the women are making shisha. And when the men arrive, they're greeted with these big buckets of shisha, and then all of the meat gets spread out on mats on the ground. And I was very proud of myself. I quickly learned that you need to just like get in there, be aggressive, get in their face, and demand the best pieces. And yeah, it works. Okay, so that's done because it's only a few days that they're hunting. That's done with the relatively lightly fermented shisha. Oh, and I should add, everything with Wari is reciprocal. So not long after this, the men organize and berate the women for not producing enough shisha, and then the women get it together. So a good time is had by all, basically. Okay, so the strongly fermented angry shisha is used in much more elaborate rituals that take place between members of different communities. The biggest ritual is called Kuroroi. It's a multi-day party. It's along with Brazilian Carnival, it's the best party that I've ever been at. And it happens when one group decides to issue an invitation to another community for a point in the future, usually about a month away. So then the host community goes to work to make as much beer as you possibly can. So this is like a mass mobilization of everybody, and especially the women. So this is a photograph. We needed our community was hosting this. It was really great, but we needed a really big beer barrel. So about 3 miles away in the forest, there was a giant hollow honey tree that was swarming with bees, but it was hollow. And so they cut a huge section like this and then made a new path, because it was in the middle of the forest, in order to roll this giant beer barrel out to the community. All the women, including me, we all went into high gear and just spent hours and hours for a couple of weeks grinding corn, brewing shisha, and then carrying our buckets into the center to pour into this giant beer barrel. What they did was they cut a bottom for it, a big round slab, and then sealed it with resin. So it was about this high. I'm not sure that I have pictures here, but. Okay, so anyway, we made mass quantities. We were ready. We filled that beer barrel, and then we were so on it that we took water tanks that the Brazilians had supplied, and filled those. So nobody had ever seen this much beer. So the structure of this party is it's about challenge and transgression of one community against the other. Basically, the hosts provide the beer. It happens in their village, in their space. The guests perform a series of transgressive violations, some of which are funny, some of which are not that funny. And then the guests respond. So after the guests have arrived, they camp in the forest, and then the first time they enter into the village, you will hear at the edge of the forest this cacophony, like I've never heard before, of all of these different sounds blaring, and then you see this wall of green palm fronds coming across like this. Those things sticking out from behind are trumpets. They're made with gourds and duck eggs that are resined onto the end with a long sort of bamboo-like tube. They're making just this cacophonous noise. It's super cool. There, from behind, you can see that better. And also some flutes. Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. So this is a flute with porcupines and spines.
You saw your cousin?
So they do this kind of invasion behind this screen of green, and if you've studied like Levi-Straussian structuralism and everything, it's all about like nature versus culture and men versus women and old versus young and like all that classic stuff, but it's really real. This is an invasion of the village, and then it becomes as transgressive as they can dream up within certain bounds of propriety. So the guy in front here, who lived to be 99, he died just a few years ago. He was the elder in our village, and he sort of took over the role of mediating. And the guys behind the screen of green called for all the young unmarried women in the village to come out and line up. And then they quizzed each of them about their sex lives and made jokes about this. Most of it was pretty funny. There were two women who had kind of done what you're not supposed to do and had affairs with Brazilians and had babies who were part Brazilian, and they came in for some very pointed quizzing that wasn't as totally funny and friendly. But it's a party, so you have to smile and you have to answer the questions. So there's a kind of like sexual violation. Why we would never talk about these things, never do this in normal everyday life. Okay, and then other kinds of transgressions will be acted out. The men may get their bows and arrows and try to hunt the chickens in the host community, actually killing them and so on. And then after they've violated all norms of decency for a while, which everybody thinks is hysterical, then they're punished, and their punishment, this is where all that massive quantity of beer that we made comes in, because the hosts get these huge kettles of this strongly fermented angry shisha, and they force it upon the men who have performed these violations. This is like a huge machismo thing. Like, you cannot turn it down, and you must drink all of it right then. None of this little like sipping thing that we're doing here. You have to drink it all right then. It's huge, huge amounts, right? So some of this is fairly random. You do it to all the visiting men. The year of this particular party, some guys from the guest community had vandalized some houses of some of our people upriver, and our people suspected who had done it. So they singled out those guys for special treatment. So you can kind of mediate some tensions and work out some social conflicts with this stuff. This was another transgressive thing that happened. My poor friend, Pete Boyne, who you see over there on the left, at dawn, the wind spirits swept in, these guys who were completely covered with charcoal and mud and everything, and started wrecking the houses. So this was serious, it wasn't in play. They were, a lot of the houses ended up completely, trashed partially, and so on. And the men can't do anything about this, but the women can. So I was super proud of her. She grabbed a giant pot of shisha and threw it over the guys.
Just a weapon.
And you can kind of see the wind spirits here who are covered in this liquid and being punished again for their transgressions.
How thick is this? Is this like the texture, like the liquidy, like beer, or is it thicker?
It has the grains.
Okay.
It has the alcoholic stuff has the grains that sink to the bottom, and so it's really liquidy. Although there can be bits of corn in there. Yeah, the sweet stuff that people drink on a daily basis hasn't separated out as much, so it tends to have more substance to it. Yeah.
Sounds like we need to have a national Chicha festival.
Well, I have to tell you one more thing and see if this appeals. Okay, so you cannot turn it down. This is a total machismo thing. I mean, on our part, it was like, we're going to show them, we're going to make so much more beer. There's no way they can drink all this. And, they don't want to lose face by not being able to drink all of it. So for weeks before a party, the men who are going to be the guests practice vomiting. And so they'll take a feather and touch the back of their throat so that they learn how to get that gag reflex going. And it really pays off, because what inevitably happens is the older guys who have been doing this their entire life, they're really good at this. They can shoot a stream like a perfect, golden liquid that lands like 3 feet away with not a drop on none. The younger guys, it's like all over, and so on. So this is the case in which the hosts don't drink at all. All of it's used as punishment against the guests for these ritual transgressions that they perform. And in contrast to the sweet shisha, which is used within the household, which turns strangers into friends and friends into relatives, you only give angry shisha, highly fermented shisha, to a non-relative. So it's all about a certain kind of tension and distancing that gets worked out through this pretty unique use of beer, which is vomited rather than swallowed. So these are other scenes from some of the events in that. What happens with repeated drinking and vomiting is that some of the men go into something that I don't really know the Western terminology for this. I call it rigidity seizures. They fall unconscious, like really unconscious, not just like drunk, but seriously out, in a fetal position that's absolutely rigid. So when I've tried to extend their limbs, you can't. Eventually, the hosts take care of these men. They massage them. Eventually, they relax. And, it's some kind of electrolyte imbalance. It's something that causes this kind of catatonia. In this case, the men who are lying down have been in this state. They've been carried to the forest. The elder from our group is watching over them to take care of them. And the state that they're in is a very sacred state. So the men are said to have died, and they fall into this state of unconsciousness that Marie called itam. This has cosmological significance. It's what happens to every human spirit at the moment of death. So in the Wari vision of death, a dying person's spirit separates from the body on earth and takes a journey to the underworld, which for them is under the deep water of lakes and deep places in the river. And there they're greeted by a giant carnivore who's also a person. His name is Towara Towara. Towara means testicle, and he has giant ones that hang down to his knees. His wife has breasts that hang down to her knees. It's all about fertility, and in this case it's animal fertility. The underworld is where the most important animals that Wari hunt come from, and it's where the ancestors, the spirits of the dead, also dwell. So one of these parties that you just saw, the Huraroin, is always in process in the underworld. It's a complete party all the time. And when the newly arrived spirit of someone whose body is approaching death but not yet dead on earth, the spirit arrives in the underworld, and Towara offers Chicha to the spirit to drink. If the spirit accepts the Chicha and drinks it, their body dies on earth. I've talked to a few people who turned it down. Their ancestors were there whispering to them, don't drink it, don't drink it. And instead the ancestors were offering them sweet, unfermented Chicha. And these people say that they turned around, they went back to earth, and they were still alive. But if you accept it, your body dies. So this is the vision of what happens at the moment of death. So, I think there are some resonances, and Betsy, you could talk about this. Other journeys to the underworld where there's food or drink that's offered, and accepting it, gives you the destiny of having to remain or having to return, something like that, and so on. Anyway, for the Wari, this is the fundamental transition between this world and the other world, between life and death. And what happens to the spirit in the underworld who drinks the Chicha is that the spirit goes into itam, into this state of unconsciousness, and then when they are revived, they are immortal. They're a perfected being. Everyone is in the prime of life. Everyone is absolutely beautiful. Everyone is vegetarian. So basically, fermentation, the production and the acceptance of highly fermented beverages transforms everyday foods into a powerful, transformative, sacred substance. So to drink of Towara Shisha is to drink of immortality, to become an immortal being who will dwell forever in this perfect world of the underworld. So I think maybe that's the idea on which to end. Fermentation as an opening not just to intoxication and not just to pleasant social relations, but in many cosmologies and mythologies, fermentation as an opening to spiritual transformation and an opening to the sacred. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I often refer to John as the Indiana Jones of Chicha, but you are definitely the Indiana Jones of Shisha. a couple-minute break if anyone's got to go to the bathroom, refill your glasses, and then I'm going to be talking about, we're going to bring it up to the past 200 years in Nashville. We talk about Nashville's brewing history, then we've got a brewing tour. Everyone, please make sure to take care of Adam, too. He's taking care of everyone in here. So just remember him, and the food bus is open, so Nicole can get you some food if you want to go out that door and order any food. So we'll get started in about 5 minutes.